Wow, I was wondering what do I need to say for people to calm down, and you did instantly by me walking on stage. I rarely have that. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, good evening and welcome here to the permanent representation of Germany to the European Union. We planned this conference more than 6 months ago. And when we were sending out invitations and reminders, and when I prepared my introductory remarks, I was wondering, the world is on fire, and we are talking about feminist foreign policy. But I think it is exactly the right moment to do so, because every moment of crisis is also a moment to question the structures and dynamics that lead to this crisis. And every crisis is a good moment and is an opportunity to think about how to start anew, how to start differently once we overcome this crisis. And this is why it is more important than ever to discuss different, maybe a different approach to foreign policy today, tomorrow, and the days to come. Why is it still that women and minorities are the first to disappear from the decision-making tables when things get tough? Why is it still that in moments of violent escalation, only those holding weapons are heard and seen, while those who advocated for peaceful solutions over decades are sidelined once again? Why is it still that the fight for equality and against discrimination is seen as a project for better times and not as a prerequisite to actually fix the mess? And how can we turn that frustration that we feel all together with the current state of affairs into a strong impetus for a different approach to foreign policy? Into an impetus to change the problematic structures, into an impetus to promote peace and stability by dismantling the patriarchal system that always brings us to the ever same patterns, into an impetus to move from militarized understanding of security to one that prioritizes the safety of human beings. In short, into a foreign policy for and by everyone. The community of those pushing for such a new foreign policy is growing. Here in Brussels, in the European Union, the first ever resolution on gender equality in foreign and security policy was adopted 3 years ago. We are right now looking into its midterm review. More and more member states of the European Union are developing a feminist foreign policy, or a foreign policy that may not be called feminist, but that still works along the same policy objectives. We see many civil society actors, I'm happy to have many of them here in this room today, that are challenging us to do even more. And we have governments all over the world who are embarking on a similar journey, and I'm very glad that we have diplomats from more than 10 of them with us in this room today. And frankly said, we were also overwhelmed by the registrations for today's and tomorrow's program, which is why we have now a live stream running in parallel. So maybe right now is the moment to take stock of the changes we have achieved and the changes we still need to achieve, but also to ask the question of how can we adopt this approach across the European Union and reach out to those who are heading in the same direction all around the world. The European Union and its 27 member states have proven again and again, if we stand together, the EU and all 27 member states, we can not only profoundly change our own policies, but also shape and change the world globally. So the world is on fire, but this is exactly why we have to talk about a feminist foreign policy and how to move beyond individual strategies and make it a joint EU approach. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, on behalf of my colleagues, Alvina Alametse and Ernest Ottersohn, and the whole Greens EFA group in the European Parliament, I welcome all of you to today's and tomorrow's series of events exploring pathways towards a European feminist foreign policy. Today's high-level kickoff panel sets the stage and provides key insights to guide our entire conference. Tomorrow, we will delve deeper into aspects on how we can build alliances between member states, how we can evaluate the alignment of the EU's foreign policy with feminism, so how feminist are we really? And we can discuss how to enhance the coherence between the EU's internal and external policies when it comes to feminism. And now, without further ado, I would like to hand over to Germany's first woman foreign minister, to the initiator of Germany's feminist foreign policy, and to a long-term ally, Annalena Baerbock. Thank you for coming. The floor is yours.
Good evening, friends. Good evening, colleagues. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, Hannah, for inviting me, and I have to apologize from the beginning. I would have loved to really discuss these important topics with you, but unfortunately, given these times, I can only give my speech in the beginning, but it was very important for me to come at all, because I believe feminist foreign policy is more important than ever. A couple of days ago, someone asked me, so, Foreign Minister, with all these crises going on around us, have you finally moved from feminist foreign policy to the real side of politics? I'm sure many of you have heard similar questions.
As Greens and feminists, we must demand a ceasefire in Palestine right now. Israel has already killed 11,000 civilians. 67% of them are women and children. How can you not demand a ceasefire? How can you not demand a ceasefire right now? Germany has given 303 million euros in weapons to... It's a collective punishment. She's only called for humanitarian corridors. Have you called? We need to call for a ceasefire right now. As feminists, we need to call for a ceasefire. The United Nations has called this.
Geh mal hin, sag, sie soll aussprechen. Sie soll einfach aussprechen. Geh mal zur Hand und sag, sie soll aussprechen müssen. Well, I will come also to the question, to the difficult questions of Israel in my speech, but now I'm taking the end of my speech ahead. I believe that the strength of feminist foreign policy is that we are capable of hearing different positions and that we are capable of listening before we give answers. So thank you for your question, and I will address it later. But well, I really believe that the discussion is about listening, and I was invited to give a speech. So I would start again, and then I will also address this difficult question. I think, as many others of you, have been addressed with this kind of question, which is actually not a question, but an accusation of saying, so, well, in the easy times, there was a time for feminist foreign politics, but now it's the real side of politics. But in a world full of crises where so many nightmares seem to have come true, my response to these kinds of questions is very clear. It doesn't get any more real than feminist foreign policy, no matter where we look. In Israel, women and children, elderly people, directly targeted by the barbarity of Hamas, thrown onto trucks, abducted, raped, killed, and paraded around and filmed as part of Hamas terrorist propaganda. In the Gaza Strip, as we just have heard, sick, old, disabled civilians, pregnant women, the most vulnerable, who are unable to flee quickly enough from the fighting, used as human shields by a terrorist organization. I'm coming to this point. I'm very sorry, but screaming doesn't solve crises at all. And also, being bombed as a refugee camp is being bombed. If you want me to address this, you must give me a chance to speak. Otherwise, we are just here screaming at each other. In Nagorno-Karabakh, tens of thousands of women, men, and children on the road, fleeing, bringing with them only what they can carry. In Ukraine, children abducted from their homeland and taken to Russian re-education camps, separated from their families, subjected to brainwashing and military indoctrination. Maybe can we stop here as well? Can you please let her in? This is also about feminist foreign policy. Could you please go out and tell the police to let her in as long as I can finish my speech? If all of this, and also this, what we see here in the room, that we are living in times where the only goal from some people is to separate us, I believe if it's nothing more real than this side of politics. This side of politics which is capable of looking at the most vulnerable in societies. Feminist foreign policy isn't an item for any other business on our agendas, not a topic we only go to when everything else looks rosy and easy. Feminist foreign policy means seeing the world as it is, sometimes, like now, as brutal, as polarized as it is, to include the perspectives of all people into our policies, particularly those most vulnerable. Feminist foreign policy means mainstreaming the rights, resources, and representation of women and marginalized people in all of the policies we work on. Germany, as Hannah Neumann has addressed, has had a feminist foreign policy for almost 2 years, so quite new. And one of the most important lessons I have learned so far is that we will only make progress within feminist foreign policy community by learning from each other, by listening to each other. And that is why I'm very glad that we're here together today. I wanted to start by sharing some of the takeaways from the last 2 years before turning how we can advance feminist foreign policy at the European level, as Anna has asked me to do so. To me, 3 attributes describe how to understand feminist foreign policy: as principled, pragmatic, and persistent. Being principled does not mean, to me, ideological, but having the courage to transform things in not only seeing, as many would describe, the reality, which is not the reality, but seeing things through figures, through data, through public opinion, but being capable to go to them who feel the reality, the normal people. And when I started foreign politics, I had been given a book by Samantha Power, and actually it's like this, so I would lie if I would have said that I read it all, but I flipped through. And one of her points was that when she became ambassador of the to the United Nations from the US, that she said she would always go to girls' or women's institution whenever she traveled. And I said, well, this is really something. So I tried to implement it as well. I'm not sticking only to women's and girls' institutions, but to young people, normal institutions. And in the beginning, when I entered office, journalists were kind of saying, now she wants to take the easy part, yeah? Not only the tough talks with the politicians, but she's also going to the women and to the boys and then sometimes playing football with them. Or they said, well, she just wants to have the nice pictures. And then I started to take journalists with me into these kind of meetings. They're not allowed to speak, they are not allowed to write about these things, just to listen. And many of them have understood that these were the hardest talks I had, because speaking to girls who have been raped by ISIS and then returning after 8 years, I mean, this is nothing where you can prepare papers beforehand, what I normally have when I go to a foreign minister and read out my speaking notes. This is a brutal reality. And I believe if we're not capable of doing this, also in this kind of situation, like we have seen now here also in the discussion, this would have led to a different kind of policies I'm taking at the moment. Because in this kind of situation, like this horrible suffering, what the woman has just been mentioning, babies dying in hospitals because of armed attacks. Frankly speaking, I can hardly bear it. And I was speaking to one of the foreign ministers when I was just at the Gulf this weekend from the Arabic countries. And he said, you know, I started to see this movie from the Israeli embassy, this 44 minutes of barbaric atrocities. And I thought I was a tough guy, but I stopped at minute 8. And I will never watch this again. And I told him, you know what I force myself in this kind of situation? Not every night, and especially not before I go to sleep, but every second day to watch these movies is the wrong word, these YouTube clips. Not because I like it and I close my eyes most of the time when I see what happened to Israeli girls, women, children. And most of the time I close my eyes when I watch what happens in Gaza to women, girls, children. But I truly believe if we are capable, or not capable, as so-called leaders in the world, to be faced with this human suffering, we do a different kind of policy. And this sounds like kind of normal and easy, but I tell you, it's not. Because like this foreign ministry from an Arab country said, it's almost unbearable. And what does it mean then by reaction from human beings? What we can see, unfortunately, also right now, that you pick only those kind of stories where you can identify with. But this means we are only looking in these kind of difficult situations only to Gaza or only to Israel. But this is not the reality. Or what is even worse, and we have seen that in many migration discussions, we don't look that women or children are suffering. When I had still in opposition discussion about family reunification, hard debates in the German Bundestag, there were slogans of migration asylum, or that this is like ferry boats over the Mediterranean seas. And after a while, I realized why people could say this, because they were speaking about numbers, 20,000, 10,000 asylum seekers coming over the Mediterranean Sea. But they didn't speak about the women who fled from Libya with her 4-year-old daughter, with her friend. And when a boat came from search and rescue teams, from NGOs, to one of the platforms, they saw one woman dead, one 4-year-old dead, and one woman still alive. And they asked the live women, So why are you here? Didn't the Libyan border guards came and rescued you? And she said, yes, they came. But my friend said, I'd rather die with my daughter on the ocean than going back to Libya. And unfortunately, she died because they didn't have enough drinking water. And I believe if we are capable of imagining that this woman would be us, that this 4-year-old would be our daughter, we would do different policies. And this is why today, and you see I'm totally off my script, but I think it's important. This is why today what I'm trying, and this was the question from the lady, and therefore I'm really a pity that she was forced to leave. This is why today, while being faced with probably, we do not have any secured numbers, 11,000 dead civilians in Gaza, and being faced with 240 hostages, from whom I met, for example, the father of one of these families. And he was telling me, and again, these are the human stories I think we have to tell. He was telling me when I came to Israel just a couple of days after the 7th of October, he said, and again, this only happens if you have a feminist foreign policy because people open like this. I know you're the foreign minister, but I know also that you're a mother of 2, and I really have to tell you something, and I will never forget this in my life. He said, do you know these times when sometimes you just wish that your kids are away because you're so busy with work and you cannot take the screaming and jumping and playing around here anymore? And I said, yes, unfortunately, yes. And then he said, never think that again, because I thought that. And then I told my wife, can you please take our daughters and go to your mother for the weekend? I need some time to rest. And they went. The wife, the 4-year-old, and the 2-year-old. And they didn't come back. And the last he saw from them was them being pushed and thrown on a truck, kidnapped by Hamas or whoever it was. So being faced with that, being faced with a husband I just met in Ramallah, who told me I had only one son and only one wife. They were killed just a couple of days in Gaza. I decided to speak about these atrocities. I decided to explain that there are dilemmas, that we cannot say we are on the side of the Palestinian people alone, or we are on the side of the Israeli people. I mean, we can say that, but this wouldn't mean to have a human foreign policy. This would mean we just make it very easy for ourselves. And therefore, I believe speaking about dilemmas is actually the most important thing of a feminist foreign policy. And I'm really thankful, and I'm totally off my script right now, to Christina Lunz and others here in the room who have forced us, politicians, to rethink politics in a way to make clear that being human, seeing the human side, is nothing weak, but the biggest strength and courage we can have. So, coming back to my script, because you want to follow a European feminist foreign policy, I understand that feminist foreign policy has to be principled, because this is the core of feminist foreign policy, not being ideology driven, but principled in our human dignity, pragmatic and persistent. So following a principled foreign policies means then in practice, concrete political action. That, for example, when we are speaking about giving humanitarian funding and speaking about, for example, supporting building of refugee camps, we always ask ourselves, what does it mean for the people in concrete? And since we have asked this at the Foreign Office, we kind of planned our refugee support a bit differently, but especially the support for setting up villages. Because when we will center the most vulnerable people in our political decisions, we talk to the women, we talk to the children, and ask them what is most important for you. And then, for example, they come up with wishes which sound very easy, and I've been criticized a lot that I talked about toilets when talking about feminist foreign policy, but because this is really human, normal life, many of them told me, you know, when your planners come, they always say that the sanitary places have to be outside of the village because of the smelling and the logical structure, but we can never go there at night as women and children, because why should we dare at night to go outside of the village to use the sanitary facilities? So the simple point of just asking the people, asking the women, asking the children what they need would turn our support with humanitarian relief work. This means when we say being principled, not making it as we did it always in the past, but really looking what people are needing. So we set clear goals for our project funding everywhere in the world to be gender sensitive and gender transformative. It means that the perspectives of women, girls, and marginalized groups must play a key role also in our resolution of crises and conflicts, even though if it might like distant for today. But in concrete again, what does it mean putting them really at the center of our resolution? Relying on firm principles, for example, in Afghanistan. We know all, unfortunately, the Taliban continue their campaign to drive women from spheres of public life. And this is why in our national program for resettling Afghans to Germany, we particularly focused on people who are at risk, especially by their gender. Again, one should think this has been the case before because this is normal, because we always speak when we speak about migrants about the most vulnerable. No, because we didn't materialize our agenda of mainstreaming. There wasn't a special focus on women and girls beforehand. Also, when we speak about these kind of situation, I believe it's very important to understand that discussions can be differently in different contexts. For example, the word feminist triggers. And we have discussed it, like we, both, as some of you might know from the Green Party, we discussed it in our party program before the German election campaign. Can we actually name it feminist foreign policy? And frankly speaking, I was a bit reluctant because I thought, oh my God, it triggers again. And then we have all the headlines and so on, so on, so on. So now, when people tell me around the world, I really want to follow your feminist foreign policy, but I cannot, or don't want to call it feminist, I think because principle doesn't mean ideologically, we shouldn't say no, because sometimes it's more important that you follow a policy, even with a different name, in order to enable it, than have a great name above it and not follow it by heart. And that it really makes a difference in the different reactions we could see in contexts where it's more difficult to have a feminist foreign policy. For example, with regard to ISIS and the rape of Yazidi women. And this brings me to my second point, being pragmatic. When I was in Iraq, I was faced again with this tremendous horrors Yazidi women had to experience in the last years. And by result, many women have born children who were born out of rape, meaning that now, even though their mothers have been freed from ISIS, they are still being labeled as these children born of rape because they do not have a surname, making them and their mothers not only vulnerable, but sometimes even incapable, for example, to come to Germany to be free and saved again because they cannot have a passport without a surname. So in this kind of discussions, for example, speaking in Iraq about feminist foreign policy, I don't care at all how it's being called over there. I don't care whether feminism is for some word they cannot even say loud. What I care for is to find also in these contexts actors who are ready to fight for a change in the national law about surnames. It sounds way far away from our feminist discussions over here. But these kind of topics can make a difference not only for thousands of children in Iraq, But when we started to dive into this kind of topic, we found out that this is a problem all around the world. Even in the Western Balkans, women being born out of rape, being today more over 20 years old, they still have the problem, because it's often also connected to religion, that they can be identified as children born out of rape. So being pragmatic as a feminist foreign policy actor also means that we draw the bigger picture. My third part is to be persistent. And this is, as we have discussed and heard also here, obviously the most tricky way. Because there are always situations where you see, like now, Gaza, Israel, the dilemma, where for a moment you think, I don't have a solution anymore. And there's a tendency to just be silent. And I believe this is the worst thing we can do, especially to most vulnerable. Many of you, especially maybe older generations, where it was even more harder to speak about a feminist foreign policy, because it was already hard to speak about feminism in our countries inside, what human rights defenders always argued: we know that you cannot bring our crimes to justice. We know that probably the perpetrators have won in the end. But what we also know is you can speak about us, because if nobody speaks about us, we are being dead alive. And this is why, again, for me, being persistent means we have to face also that some are calling us, you are using double standards. But for me, the answer is, then we have to be even more persistent, speaking about the dilemmas which we cannot solve, but speaking about the victims, both in Gaza and in Israel. Speaking about, for example, also in regard to the Russian war on Ukraine, that also in Russia, there were people, and are still people, suffering under the Putin regime. And again, this brings us to very pragmatical topics. We had a debate last year in the European Foreign Affairs Council about passports and visa. It sounded very technical, and it was about whether we should still have Schengen visas for Russian nationals. Maybe you have read it in the newspaper. There was also the argumentation from the Baltics, and then a bit from Germany, and there was a perfect story for saying there's a big clash in the European Union between East and West. But actually, I believe it was showing that both sides, in this case, Baltic countries and myself as a German foreign minister, we tried to look at the people. And from the Baltic argumentation, it was, how can we give Schengen visas to Russian people while Ukrainians are being bombed by Russian citizens? And then there comes a Russian oligarch spending their summer vacation in Paris next to a Ukrainian refugee. And this was a total reasonable argument. And then I came with my story, trying to say, but not all Russians are being oligarchs, and we try to sanction them and freeze their assets and try to prevent that they can do summer holidays. But we have to see also those who went to the demonstrations, and then Putin arrested them, who had lost their children because they said in school war about the Ukrainian situation. And we have to give them also a chance to come to Europe. And again, being capable of speaking about both sides from the human dimension and not about Schengen visa regulation on technical levels, we find a solution which is obviously a good one for those in Russia also fighting Putin's brutal regime and preventing that in the end only those who are misusing our humanity could get these kind of visas. Being persistent also means, and then it becomes a bit harder, than when we were speaking about Afghanistan, that we didn't only look at the side, as Secretary General Amina Mohammed was saying in the General Assembly in September so eloquently. I quote, "Don't ever take women's rights for granted, because they could always be taken away from you," as we have seen in Afghanistan. but that we had also a heavy discussion on the question whether we can support Afghanistan as we did in the past with humanitarian, but especially development aid, if by this we have to fulfill the order from the Taliban regime because they told us, the donors, the international community, women are not allowed to go to work again. And again, there's no easy way out, because on one hand, there were those people saying, but if you stop now humanitarian aid, 100,000 of Afghans will die because they do not have water and do not have food. And on the other hand, there was this argumentation, which I was leaning to, this is true, but if we think it through, if women are not being allowed to work for international organizations anymore, will women and children actually receive the water and the food? And the answer was probably not, because the other order from the Taliban was that women are not allowed to speak to foreign men. So they could not even receive the water and the food. But again, this is not a black and white discussion. So what is right and what is wrong in the end? I think we always have to look at the special case, and we found solution where still agencies could provide it. But if we wouldn't have faced this dilemma from the front run, we either would have taken a decision, no funding at all anymore, or, which I believe would have been the decision which have been there in the past before we had a feminist foreign policy worldwide group of foreign ministers, we would have just ignored the order from the Taliban, not speaking about the question, what does it mean that women cannot go to work for our realities. So being persistent again means facing the dilemmas and trying to make the good decisions, even though with dilemmas it always has some shortcomings. And this brings me to, and I'm trying to shorten my speech a bit at the end, to our situation in Germany and also in the European Union. Being persistent obviously also means, and this is then the easy part, whatever you preach outside your own country, you should do double in your own country, because thanks God we do live in democracies, and thanks God, therefore, it's way easier to address these issues. Therefore, for example, we tried to do everything within the last 2 years, not only to follow our feminist foreign policy outside, but looked also internally with our coalition treaty, what kind of still not remained issues do we have in Germany when next time we will be addressed at the Human Rights Council for the human rights situation in Germany. So one of the things we did, thanks God, was that the situation beforehand, that in Germany you could still be prosecuted for providing information on safe abortion on your website. We changed the law for that. So it is not only the German foreign minister going to the US and saying, you know, abortion is, in my point of view, really a human right, a woman's right, but I could say also that within our own constitution, within our own legislation, we have done everything so that women can be informed as much as they are needed. A bit more tricky question for Germany is the question of representation in our parliaments. And this is why I force myself always to speak also about representation, even though on an international level the rights question is obviously of high importance. But if we look all together within the German Bundestag, we are not at 50%. And again, then traveling abroad shows me so much that feminist foreign policy is not, as many journalists argued in the beginning, just some Western idea, because if I travel to Latin America, but also to Africa, I meet often parliamentarians who said, we just passed a law for a quota in our parliament, or in Rwanda, they did it years ago, with a 50% quota. So something we are still not having in many European countries, and unfortunately also not in Germany. But what I can do in my own ministry is to look at our ambassadors and councils, which still is also not at 50%. So we put quotas for our own embassies, and especially the high-ranking one, saying how we want to change it. And also my ministry. It is hard discussions, because obviously it's also power discussion. If you say we don't want to wait for the next 80 years by a normal evolvement, you have to have, and now I'm off my script again, so I don't know the English word, Sprungbeförderung, yeah? And there are always some very good lawyers saying, but this is totally illegal, yeah? So obviously you have to be also pragmatic to follow feminist foreign policy within your own offices. And we can learn many things from our European partners. France, Spain, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Slovenia, they have all adopted explicitly feminist foreign policies. Some of them pushing feminists a lot, some of them, and they know it already, I've discussed it, with the Swedes, for example. Yeah, they deleted the label with the new government. So I said, so shall I delete you also from our feminist foreign network? We have a signal group of that. No. Because you can see that obviously these groups, yeah, this is also power groups because we are sharing information, we are working together worldwide. And the European Parliament has been a driving force behind the feminist foreign policy at European level. The 2020 resolution that called on all EU member states to adopt a feminist foreign policy, which was co-authored by Hannah, was a very important milestone for that. So I'm thanking you very much also for the conference today, because also we in Germany, we need this great input from the European level to get better also on the national side, because you have been a trailblazer when it comes to the feminist foreign policy agenda and also inspiring resolutions, but also help then again in the national parliament to say, but this is what the EU is calling for. Maybe this is not only a feminist idea, but this is what the EU is calling for. So the significant progress which has been made on the European level is still highly important, and there are also some people from the European Commission. So I would really like to encourage you to keep on trying to close the gender pay gap, including through your gender equality strategy. Also the question of gender equality within the EU is of high importance, addressing the disparities, making it very transparent. And the EEAS has now dedicated an ambassador for gender and diversity. However, we can and have to do obviously more also on the European level. We are not at 50%. So I would say also in the front of the European election, this is one important task where we can work all together. And then it comes to the question of resources. Obviously, in German we have a saying, bei Geld hört die Freundschaft auf. And this is also the case in coalition discussions, and this is obviously also the case on the European level when we speak about the MFF. But again, the experience, because a lot of power lies within the budgetary questions. If we are gender blind with regard to where the money goes, obviously, we can never fulfill a true feminist foreign policy. And therefore, I believe it's crucial for us to expand monitoring of the gender effects by our spending behaviors to see where the money goes. I strongly believe that in the upcoming negotiations for the next MFF, we have to move forward gender budgeting at EU level throughout the entire MFF. This sounds technical again, and I know how much also on the national level people are being annoyed by this, but I could see within my own budget for the Foreign Office, when I said, and now we look at all our spending, whether this is gender sensitive or gender transformative, I mean, we found out so many other important things. I cannot speak about loud now. For example, that in some regards, I questioned, we are paying money there. Why didn't anybody check that for the last 20 years? Because we had a big debate, for example, about our Goethe Institute. This is a totally different story. But looking where our money goes also showed us that we have some cultural institutions which still are based on the facts of 1950, where it was very important to have reading halls between France and Germany because we just were at the end of the Second World War, and Germany had to do everything to regain trust in Europe. But being capable of having gender budget view means also to be more transparent and therefore being more efficient. So I believe what is capable in local communities and what we call for our candidate countries, because when we look at the budgetary support with regard to regional support or social cohesion support, gender budgeting is nothing new, and therefore it can be also the case for our common EU budget. Another point which I believe is of high importance is to look very critical at the personal and the civilian CSDP missions. They have similar numbers than we had before I came into office in my foreign office, so I don't blame them. But the number is at 23% female. So if we are speaking about foreign policy in the civil field, obviously we do have to do way more. And this is a long way from the goal you set yourself with regard to the civilian compact. But leading by example, what Europe sometimes tries to do, means also to be capable to finally implement our gender action plan, being capable of being persistent also with our own representation in this regard. And having said all this, obviously it takes time. Obviously, we will not reach 50% in the CDFC missions by 1 year. But again, we should try. We have seen where we've come from over the last decades, and we have seen what being really vocal and active on the feminist foreign level means in reality. It can save life. It can save life because you realize that you won't stop all the dying currently in Gaza. But if we wouldn't try, we wouldn't save anybody at all. And if we mean it very frank, that every life matters, then also saving every single life matters. And this is what feminist foreign policy is all about. It doesn't get more real as this. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna-Lena, for making the time, for joining us here tonight. And because our Minister of Foreign Affairs has to leave, as you know, she's very involved in organizing mediation, de-escalation efforts, especially in the Middle East. We had to slightly change the kickoff panel. So basically, I will try to be the green voice, trying to be half European and half German from now on, basically replacing Anna-Lena. And therefore, we have Terry Schulz, who's going to moderate us tonight. So I just give over the floor to you and become just a very normal panelist.
Are we on? Hannah, you don't do anything just normally, so thank you for being on my panel. I'd like to call up our other members here. Stefano Sannino, he is the Secretary General of the European External Action Service. Katarzyna Pizarska, she is the chair of the Warsaw Security Forum, president of the European Academy of Diplomacy, and co-founder of Women in International Security Poland, WISE. Many of you may have heard of it. And Lilia Antoniuk. She's the executive director of the NGO Women's League in Ukraine. And she didn't even advertise herself this way, but I found it on X. She has just become the first gender equality fellow at Shape Dem EU, which is an EU-funded project that aims to rethink, reshape, and review democracy support policies in eastern and southern neighborhoods. So I'm very pleased to have all of you here. Oh, and Hannah. Sorry, and not to forget Hannah, who of course is one of the reasons this conference exists, and a tireless advocate for feminist foreign policy, as well as so many other issues that are important to women. So thank you very much. I'm very honored to be here. I will sit down now. I'm a journalist here in Brussels, covering the EU and NATO, and come in contact with these people in my daily life, but I just want to say how honored I am to be here tonight, to be invited to join this panel. And after a speech like that by the German foreign minister, and not just the speech, but the comportment and her dignity, I just have to say that I'm a little nervous for us to hold up the quality here, but I'm sure we can do it. So we are going to have a round of questions and then open to the audience, because one of the important parts of feminist foreign policy is listening to others, and not just these impressive speakers and the ones that you'll also hear tomorrow, but all of you here in that room. It takes every one of us and everyone else who's not in this room, obviously, to implement the things that the foreign minister talked about, which are so important to saving lives. So we'll get started now, and I'm going to give Stefano the hard question to begin with. Something, Annalena was making eye contact with you a lot, so you're probably already feeling a little nervous here. No? Okay, good. Well, let's start with, as she directed to you, what accomplishments have there been since in your tenure as the Secretary General at EEAS? I mean, can you point to tangible accomplishments, and what do you think are the most urgent actions going forward? And I will say here that when we talk about moving to a higher representation of women in the services, I learned this, that it is not you who can appoint more women if the member states don't send more women appointees, nominees. So this can't all be on your head, but I know that this is something that is a goal that certainly the EEAS shares. So Stefano, please.
Thanks a lot. And then maybe I should start first of all, and the minister was mentioning an ambassador for gender and diversity, Stella Roner, who I think has done a fantastic job in order to give visibility and political content to this work. So not just, let's say, checking the implementation of a number of things, but really being the face, the voice, the heart, the mind of a number of actions that have been taken. And then the second point that I need to make as a starter, it's the fact that I'm not coming from zero. I mean, maybe there was a feminist foreign policy more recent in Germany, but the EIS has a longer tradition, because my predecessor was doing a lot of, Helga was doing a lot of feminist foreign policy. So I mean, building on that, we have tried to work on a number of different strengths of work. First of all, working on the internal, external. I believe very much in what the minister was saying. You cannot go outside and preach outside if you're not practicing at home. So the idea is to, let's say, first of all, lead by example. Hannah, the first time that we met, you were, I'd say, challenging me to double the resources for gender and diversity. I have tripled the resources for gender and diversity. And I have done something, together with Stella, with the agreement of everybody, we have moved to Stella to be double-headed, so she will continue to be an ambassador for gender and diversity, reporting directly to me, but she will also be, she has already become also director for human rights and multilateral issues, and that's giving her a firepower, which is much greater from that point of view, and I hope that can be an element of multiplication in our sector. So first of all, resources, devoting resources, because otherwise, I mean, you cannot do things. Second point, working internally on the idea of the gender-responsive leadership. This is not something that can be done. I mean, if you want to have a gender policy, it cannot be done by the ambassador for gender and diversity or by me, and that's it. So I mean, it needs to be with the involvement of all the structure, of all the machinery, and it is something that, I mean, changing the mentality, it's something that takes some time. And again, I mean, it's very, I think a lot of colleagues may say, but what could they do? And I mean, I was telling them, look inside, maybe you will find what you can do in order to improve the situation. But practically, we have started, and I have made compulsory now gender responsive leadership training for all our management. But more concretely, we have started working on how to implement it. So I'm asking my managers to give for themselves objectives on what they can do in order to improve the situation inside. I'm introducing an element of gender responsiveness in the mission letters for all our heads of delegation, all our ambassadors that are going abroad.
So are these public, these objectives?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I'm telling them that I want that you also tell me, because I understand that you cannot do one size fits all. So I want that you tell me which are the things that you can do. And in our assessment, in the assessment for the work that you are doing, I will consider also as managers what you've done in order to improve the situation when it comes to gender equality and when it comes to actions that can be taken in terms of diversity. I am also glad to, to have at least worked a lot in increasing the figures. We are not at 50%, but we are approaching 40%, which is let's say, already a decent midterm objective.